Okay, good morning, everyone. Okay, good morning. As the Market Risk Advisory Committee alternate designated federal officer, it is my pleasure to call this meeting to order. Before we begin this morning's discussion, I would like to turn to Commissioner Johnson, sponsor of the MRAC, for her opening remarks.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Marilee. Welcome to everyone. Earlier this summer, I had the privilege of delivering a keynote address at the Salzburg Global Finance Forum. As I noted in my remarks, it was 13 years ago that I participated in my first CFTC convening. It was a joint roundtable with the SEC, and the purpose of the roundtable was to begin the Commission's effort to work in collaboration to implement harmonized regulation, adopting the anticipated Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act that Congress passed in July of 2010. I'm hopeful that my opportunity to serve as an expert and my path to service as a commissioner will inspire young professionals, economists, lawyers, data analysts, among others, to consider public service or find opportunities to give of their time and talent to enhance regulatory oversight across the financial market sector. During today's MRAC meeting, our second meeting in 2023 and our third convening since I assumed the sponsorship of the MRAC, the spirit of this thoughtful engagement and collaboration that has characterized many CFTC convenings over the years continues. In fact, some of MRAC's subcommittee and parent committee members were at that convening 13 years ago, if you can believe it. At the outset of the meeting, allow me to thank our MRAC chair and chairman of the FIA Board of Directors, Alicia Crichton, our MRAC designated federal officer, Bruce Fekrat, and Marilee Dahlman, special counsel, Division of Market Oversight, and alternate designated federal officer. I also want to thank each of the ADFOs who support MRAC, Lillian Cardona, Daniel O'Connell, Harisa Nuri, and my senior counsel, staff, Matt Rowland, as well as Adrian Anderson. As I've previously noted, the MRAC's productive subcommittees have historically examined and produced valuable interventions to the Commission addressing complex regulatory issues. At today's meeting, the MRAC subcommittees and experts will share details on subcommittee work streams, including initiatives launched by the CCP Risk and Governance Subcommittee on CCP Recovery and Resolution, Margin and Collateral Guidelines, and Technology and Operations. The Market Structure Subcommittee will share updates regarding the subcommittee's work streams on block implementation rules, FCM concentration and capacity, U.S. Treasury market reform, and post-trade risk reduction. The Interest Rate Benchmark Reform Subcommittee will share a final report regarding the transition away from LIBOR, acknowledging the benefits that emerging technologies may offer, including reduced frictions, settlement timing, and costs, as well as increased efficiency and access. An expert panel will examine the conflicts of interest that may arise when firms employ centralized or decentralized infrastructure, integrating diverse operational functions to enable trading in traditional financial markets, as well as in the context of digital asset or cryptocurrency markets. This discussion draws on a rich history, as well as implications and lessons learned from vertical integration in traditional finance markets. I strongly support the anticipated discussion, as well as the recent CFTC staff release requesting comment on the impact of affiliations of certain CFTC regulated entities. I applaud the efforts and the leadership of the divisions of market oversight, clearing and risk, and market participants. Just a month ahead of this release, on May 30th, 2023, I called for the Commission to consider proposed rules that act as a matter to respond to crypto winter last year. Among other issues, I believe it is imperative that the Commission understand the nature and implications of these affiliations in both traditional and innovative financial service markets. Finally, in anticipation of the Commission's second voluntary carbon market convening scheduled for next week, July 19, 2023, the Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee will share an update on domestic and international market, operational, and regulatory developments in the market for carbon offsets. If I might share quickly, our agenda opens with a presentation from CCP Risk and Governance. The committee will focus on recent successes in advancing a final rule for DCO governance. We'll hear presentations from the CCP Risk and Governance Subcommittee co-chairs, Alessandro Coco, Vice President and Head of the Financial Markets Group at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and Chris Edmonds, Chief Development Officer at the Intercontinental Exchange, as well as co-chair emeritus Alicia Crichton, Chair of the FIA Board of Directors and Chair of the MRAC. The subcommittee will present on 3 work streams: margin and collateral guidelines, recovery and resolution, and technology and operational risk. With respect to the first work stream, we anticipate discussions on a number of topics, including model transparency for initial margin, anti-procyclicality measures, volatility parameter floors, model responsiveness for cleared and uncleared initial margin models to market shocks, price volatility controls, and access to data for regulators. The subcommittee will evaluate timely questions in this area and important topics, including questions with respect to collateral guidelines. The Recovery and Resolution Workstream anticipates considering the Commission's proposed rules referenced in the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on orderly and wind down plans for DCOs, as well as public comments on the same. It will also consider the implications of EMIR guidance with respect to, in particular, EMIR 3.0 proposals. Finally, the Technology and Operations Workstream will continue to examine a discussion started during the March 8, 2023 MRAC meeting on the vulnerabilities that arise as a result of new technology infrastructure. We'll hear after that, notwithstanding the actual agenda, from the Market Structure Subcommittee. The Market Structure Subcommittee co-chair, Biz Chatterjee, will address forthcoming Market Structure Subcommittee work streams, including block implementation rules, as well as U.S. Treasury market reforms, the concentration and capacity in FCM markets, and post-trade risk reduction. This is an out-of-order presentation, but helpful in some ways as our very busy, exceptionally important experts share their time and talents with us today. In fact, after Biz presents, the Interest Rate Benchmark Reform Subcommittee will offer a presentation by co-chair Ann Battle, Senior Counsel, Market Transitions, and Head of Benchmark Reform at ISDA. Ann will share a video culminating the accomplishments of the IRBR subcommittee, which we are all celebrated in a number of ways over the course of the last year. The achievements of the IRBR subcommittee reflect a multi-year effort to support the transition away from the London interbank offered rate to risk-free rates. Following Ann's presentation and a celebration of all of those who worked tremendously hard to ensure the success of that transition, we'll hear from a panel of experts in the context of the Future of Finance Subcommittee's future work streams. From the beginning of my term as a commissioner and for many years prior to my service, I have encouraged a comprehensive and thoughtful dialogue regarding emerging financial products, technology, and evolving market structures. As a result of rapid growth in the digital assets markets, as well as increasing adoption of innovative technologies, it is imperative for the Commission to continue to foster a public conversation with diverse stakeholders, as well as other federal and international regulators to coordinate and collaborate on the adoption of harmonized regulations. Today, we'll hear from a panel of experts with respect to the questions relating to conflicts of interest in the context of custody, or more specifically, the adoption of vertical integration in the digital assets and traditional finance markets. Our panel of experts includes Rebecca Reddick, Chief Policy Officer, Polygon Labs, Yesha Yadav, Associate Dean, and Robert Belton, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Community, Milton R. Underwood, Chair, Professor of Law, and Faculty Co-Director of the LLM program at Vanderbilt Law School, Stephen Schwartz, Stanley A. Starr, Distinguished Professor of Law at Duke University Law School, Jason Allegrante, Chief Legal and Compliance Officer at Fireblocks, and Chin Ard, Chief External Affairs Officer at Solidus Labs. Reflecting on the history of vertical integration in the residential mortgage-backed securities markets, panelists will describe the epistemological challenges of defining and deconstructing the term vertical integration. In addition, panelists will distinguish the use of vertical integration in traditional finance markets from digital asset to crypto markets, and distinguish between centralized and decentralized operational infrastructure, including as relates to self-custody. They'll offer risks, some mitigation initiatives, as well as some recommendations. Finally, today we'll hear, just in anticipation of the Commission's second voluntary carbon market convening, from a panel that will explore trends in environmental commodity markets, both voluntary and compliance, as well as jurisdictional challenges that arise in the context of regulating markets for underlying carbon offsets. Tyson Slocum, Director of Public Citizens, Director of the Energy Program, and Peter Malyshev, Partner at Cadwalder, will share reflections on this topic. This meeting is an opportunity to roll up our sleeves and begin to chart a course for the development and completion of the important work that the MRAC subcommittees will explore. I'm hopeful for an open, meaningful discussion among MRAC members regarding the critical issues facing our markets. Before we move into the substance of today's meeting, I want to also thank my chairman and my fellow commissioners for their participation today and for their service sponsoring the Agricultural, Energy and Environmental, Global and Technology Advisory Committees. I want to acknowledge the hard work of all of my fellow commissioners and the membership of their committees that they sponsor, which will produce thoughtful recommendations critical to the development of regulations and policies and best practices in our industry. At the MRAC, we welcome collaboration across the advisory committees, AAC, EMAC, TAC, and GMAC. We will seek out opportunities to connect with each of the leaderships, with the leadership of each of these committees, the chair and the other commissioners who sponsor these advisory committees, so that our work can be accomplished in tandem and our efforts will be most effective. With that, I'll turn it over to my fellow commissioners who are joining us virtually today for their remarks. I look forward to a robust and informative discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Commissioner. Now we will hear opening remarks from Commissioner Goldsmith Romero.
Good morning. I'm so pleased to be here today to welcome the members of the Market Risk Advisory Committee, MRAC. I want to thank Commissioner Johnson for her sponsorship of MRAC and all of the staff for their work in organizing this meeting. As I was thinking about this meeting and market risk, I thought about the fact that market risk is never static. The only thing that can be truly known is that there'll be risk. Where that risk arises is an area that must be closely monitored, and this includes both traditional areas of risk and emerging areas. At the last MRAC meeting, I talked about areas of risk on banks, including risk related to changing interest rates and risk related to an uncertain economic environment. And then immediately after, we saw those risks manifest with the failure of Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate Bank, and Signature Bank, followed by government action to stop contagion to other banks and the broader economy. And those bank failures were caused in part by a mix of traditional risks, such as a failure of interest rate risk management and a lack of diversification, as well as emerging risks. For example, if we think about the speed of online banking coupled with social media played a role in snowballing customer redemptions. And there was also exposure of certain banks to digital asset firms. So market participants and regulators like the CFTC should remain nimble in how we think about market risk, how we monitor the risk, and ultimately, how do we promote market resilience? Last month, when the Commission issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking related to risk assessment, I called for us to be forward-looking to ensure that our risk management frameworks capture future risk as it could evolve or emerge. And similarly, I hope that the MRAC could help with that. This is similar to prudential regulators. Federal Reserve Board Vice Chair Michael Barr recently testified before the Senate how, quote, recent events have shown that we must evolve our understanding of banking in light of changing technologies and emerging risks. To that end, we are analyzing what recent events have taught us about banking, customer behavior, social media, concentrated and novel business models, rapid growth, deposit runs, interest rate risk, and other factors, and we are considering the implications for how we should be regulating and supervising our financial institutions and how we think about financial stability, end quote. The CFTC should do the same. I'm interested in hearing from MRAC members about how they are being nimble in their assessment of risk, both traditional risk and emerging risk. I'm also interested in MRAC members' views about how the Commission can be nimble in its assessment of risk, and also ultimately how we can promote resilience to risk. I look forward to today's discussion and thank you for all of your service.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now we will hear opening remarks from Commissioner Mersinger.
Good morning, and thank you to Commissioner Johnson for organizing today's meeting of the Market Risk Advisory Committee. I am certain today will be full of robust discussion and debate over a number of topics which are critical to the work we're doing here at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. So at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'm going to once again emphasize the importance of advisory committees to the CFTC. These meetings provide a public forum for stakeholder input on issues facing the markets we regulate. We as regulators cannot operate in a vacuum, making decisions and taking actions without the benefit of the knowledge, expertise, and experience of those involved in our markets. Thankfully, the history of active engagement by the CFTC's advisory committees has ensured that this agency benefits from the wealth of information, ideas, and sound recommendations offered by those who devote their time to serving on these committees. I want to applaud Commissioner Johnson's decision to continue drawing from the experience of a number of the MRAC subcommittees created before her sponsorship. I'm certain the Commission will continue to learn and benefit from the work streams before the CCP Risk and Governance Market Structure and Climate-Related Risk subcommittees. I also want to commend the forward-looking creation of the Future of Finance subcommittee. I think we can all agree that the subjects of these subcommittees are very relevant now and likely to remain so well into the future. In addition to the updates from the MRAC subcommittees, I expect insightful discussion during the panels on today's agenda. We spend a lot of time thinking and talking about the future of market structure here at the agency, but also at every industry event and foreign regulator conference that I've attended. There's no shortage of issues to focus on, and it's better that we have these discussions proactively rather than in the alternative. Finally, I'm pleased to see Tyson Slocum, Director of Public Citizens Energy Program, on today's MRAC agenda. Tyson is also a distinguished member of the advisory committee I sponsor, the Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee. Tyson is always insightful. He's very outgoing. And just to tell you a quick story about Tyson, before one of our meetings, we spoke to a classroom full of students at Oklahoma State University. I went first, and I'm fairly certain that when I was done, there was a classroom full of sleeping college students. After boring these poor kids with my thoughts, I looked to Tyson, who does have experience teaching college courses, to offer some comments. And the room certainly perked up as his commanding voice shared interesting and engaging stories and information about the impact of commodity futures trading on the prices paid by the average American household. So I think we will all enjoy hearing from Tyson today as well. Again, just thank you to Commissioner Johnson for holding today's meeting. Thanks for all the staff who put in a lot of time and effort in creating agendas and preparing for today's meetings. Of course, special thanks to the IT and telecom staff who are really critical to making sure these events come together. And thanks to all the members of the MRAC and the subcommittees for your service to these advisory committees. Your participation is really a public service, and it's undeniably beneficial to the work we do at the CFTC. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from today's subcommittees and panels.
Thank you, Commissioner. And now we will hear opening remarks from Commissioner Pham.
Thank you, Commissioner Johnson, Marilee Dahlman, and everyone else who helped arrange today's meeting. I would also like to extend my thanks to the members and subcommittee members of the Market Risk Advisory Committee, along with the presenters, for your time and dedication to advising the Commission and sharing your expertise. Your service makes all of this possible. There is an incredible agenda for today's meeting. Over the next only 3 hours, the agenda includes all of the following: the launch of work streams for 4 subcommittees, discussion topics including central counterparty risk and governance, interest rate benchmark reform, market structure and climate-related risk, innovative and emerging technologies affecting the derivatives and related financial markets, advancing efforts on existing consultations by discussing central counterparty resolution and recovery, margin and collateral guidelines, and technology and operations. New topics such as discussions on block implementation rules, capacity and concentration in the Futures Commission merchants market, Treasury market reform, and post-trade risk reduction. And finally, hearing the development of subcommittee consultations. I continue to appreciate Commissioner Johnson and the MRAC's recognition and support of the Global Markets Advisory Committee, which I sponsor. As I previously announced, our upcoming July 17th meeting will address topics related to U.S. Treasury market reform, continuing the GMAC's work that began in 2021 and reflecting the discussions I've had with both the U.S. Treasury Department as well as with Chairman Benham. In addition, the upcoming meeting will cover swap block thresholds and tokenization of assets. I appreciate that the MRAC has looked to the GMAC's initiatives over the past year, including the GMAC's first meeting in February and published 2023 to 2025 work program for consultation, and seeks to build on the GMAC's work, including by briefly previewing these topics for the GMAC's in-depth consideration at the New York Stock Exchange next week. Because the GMAC is focused on ensuring that there is a level playing field for global businesses and global markets, I encourage the MRAC to leverage the resources of its members and focus on pressing issues relating to risks in our markets, given the shock and turmoil of recent market stresses. It is critically important that the risks in our markets do not go unexamined by the Commission and its advisory committees. I appreciate the MRAC's foundation established by then Commissioner Benham when he sponsored the MRAC. Indeed, to begin, we should acknowledge his MRAC's role in the interest rate benchmark reform that we are celebrating today. For instance, the past iteration of the MRAC, among other things, issued a user guide for the transition of exchange-traded derivatives activity to SOFR, and recently we just had our first MAT determinations deemed approved by the Commission for SOFR and SONIA swaps. I look forward to hearing updates on LIBOR transition. This is a tremendous moment in history for our markets and a once-in-a-lifetime event, given that the origins of LIBOR date back over 50 years to 1969. I reiterate that it is important for the CFTC to have expert advice from market participants and the public, and that your efforts help the Commission understand the issues from the perspective of those directly affected, as we consider the most effective and efficient ways to mitigate and manage risk. I thank you again for your service and time and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Commissioners, for your opening remarks. Before starting our discussion, there are a few logistical items that I'll mention to the committee members. If you would like to be recognized during the discussion, please message within the Zoom chat. I'll alert Chair Crichton that you would like to speak. And please identify yourself before you begin speaking and signal when you're done speaking. If you get disconnected from Zoom, please close your browser and enter the Zoom link again that was previously provided. And one quick note as well, we're going to flip the order of a couple of panels. We're actually going to, we'll continue to start with CCP, but after that, we'll do market structure and then do the IRBR presentation. So we'll flip the order of market structure and IRBR. Okay, so before we get started, I'll do a roll call of the MRAC members. So we have your attendance on the record. After I say your name, please indicate that you're present and then mute your line. Chair Alicia Crichton.
Present.
Robert Allen.
Present.
Stephen Berger.
Present.
Dick Berner.
Present.
Alessandro Coco.
Present.
Biz Chatterjee.
Present.
Neil Constable.
Present.
Tim Cuddihy. I'm not hearing from Tim. Okay, looks like Tim wasn't here. Ed Dasso.
Present.
Tina Gale Fletcher.
Present.
Graham Harper.
Present.
Lindsay Hopkins.
Present.
David Horner.
Present.
Annette Hunter. Present. Dimitri Kuzurolsa. And I do think Dimitri is having some tech issues earlier. Dimitri, were you able to connect? No, okay. Eileen Keeley?
Present.
Elizabeth Kirby?
Present.
Garrett Kleinbauer?
Present.
Brittany Conkey?
Present.
Jonathan Levin?
Present.
Jonathan, oh, great. Okay. Chip Lowry,
Present.
Purvi Manaras,
Present.
Craig Messenger,
Present.
Andrew Nash, Andrew, are you on the line? Okay. Ashwini Penn,
Present.
Andrew Park,
Present.
Jessica Rainier,
Present.
Marnie Rosenberg,
Present.
Tyson Slocum,
Present.
great. Kristen Smith,
Present.
and Kevin Werbach.
Present.
All right. Okay. Thank you all very much for attending. And I will turn it over now to Chair Crichton.
Thank you and good morning. Appreciate you all joining us today. As Commissioner Johnson's indicated, we'll dive into the work already getting underway at the subcommittee level, particularly the CCP Risk Subcommittee and the Market Structure Subcommittee. I'd like to say at the outset how much I appreciate the hard work of subcommittee leadership and all subcommittee members. I'm looking forward to hearing from these subcommittees today, as well as seeing initial analysis and other work products from them later this year. Importantly, I'm looking forward to hearing a final report from the IRBR subcommittee. While the work of this subcommittee has finally concluded, I'm very pleased to hear an overview of this subcommittee's achievements and have the opportunity to express our gratitude for their expertise and dedication over the past several years. To provide an update and general overview of subcommittee work, I'd like to let you know that the subcommittee, the CCP and Market Structure subcommittees have appointed leadership and an impressive membership list. These two subcommittees have already met and have begun the hard work of developing issues and work streams associated with each of those subcommittees. We'll hear in more detail from Chris, Alessandro, and Biz in a short while. There are two additional important MRAC subcommittees, the Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee and the Future of Finance Subcommittee. Our intention is to finalize membership and leadership roles and establish a pathway for these subcommittees to meet soon. Looking further ahead, I also wanted to alert members to our current thinking that we expect another MRAC meeting in late September of this year, and we'll be publishing dates shortly. Now let's turn to the first section of the day, which is CCP Risk and Governance. This subcommittee has met and had productive discussions concerning anticipated work streams. For this section, I'd like to introduce CCP subcommittee co-chairs, Chris Edmonds, Chief Development Officer of ICE, and Alessandro Coco, Vice President and Head of Financial Markets, the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, who will be supported by Co-Chair Emeritus Alicia Crichton. After these presentations, we'll have some time for open discussion from our members. Chris and Alessandro, please feel free to begin the presentation.
Good morning, Commissioner Johnson, Commissioner Goldsmith, Romero, Commissioner Merzinger, Commissioner Pham and staff, and good morning, Chair Crichton. Thank you for having me here today. With the support of Commissioner Johnson and her staff and the support of Chair Crichton, Chris and I have assembled a team of experts who will serve on this subcommittee. Our focus is to make sure that a broad diversity of viewpoints is represented so that we can make better recommendations to the Commission and the public. We have representatives of end users, FCMs, CCPs, regulators, and academia. This list may be integrated with additional names in the future as more members complete the confirmation process. Here's the list of members who have been confirmed so far and the corresponding categories. We have Dick Berner from academia, Lee Betzel, CCPs, Reggie Griffith, end users, Juan Blackwell, end users, Raj Ramanath, FCMs, David Horner, CCPs, Dimitri Senko, CCPs, Tim McHenry, regulators, Lee Betzel, CCPs, Graham Harper, end users, and Chris Edmonds and I will be the co-chairs. With that, I hand it over to Chris.
Thanks, Alessandro, and thank you all for the opportunity to participate today and on this important work. We will be brief on our overview. We have identified 3 different work streams, and we have allocated the resources that Alessandro just went through into these 3 work streams to identify a wide variety of opinions and identify the issues that we see forthcoming. The 3 work streams are margin and collateral, resolution and recovery, and technology and operations. Dmitry Senko is chairing our margin and collateral conversation. Alessandro will handle the recovery and resolution, and I am chairing the technology and operation work stream. Thus far, all of the work streams have met, at least initially, and determined an initial list of topics for consideration that will begin the earnest of their work. We will be meeting monthly at this point in time at the work stream level in order to provide progress reports leading into our next full MRAC meeting as it takes place, hopefully in the fall timeframe. Thus far, I don't know if Dimitri joined or if he can hear, but I don't know, Dimitri, if you want to walk through the next slide on the margin and collateral workstream priorities.
Yes, I can. Hope you can hear me.
We can hear you.
If you can switch to the next slide, I think. Yeah, so we met to discuss our working plan to work on a set of topics. Subset of them are shown here, and then we have evaluated a broader list and with some subtopics within each category that we want to discuss, and kind of to mention the main points or the main topics here. We will work on model transparency for initial margin and procyclicality, and provide our recommendation on these matters. So there are also kind of further detailization here, and maybe differentiated treatment is needed for different types of models in place, bar-based, span-based, and some other differentiation may be needed. We will discuss the topic of margin period of risk, which was already started in the last iteration of the committee the last year, but needs to be continued. Also, we will cover the topics about responsiveness of model, both in comparing contrasting models used in cleared space, but also in non-cleared initial margin models, and how the system, or what's the ideal outcome for the whole system, cleared and uncleared, to react to provide the intended outcome in a broader sense for the whole system, not only cleared. We will further, and that's in connection to the topic of margin period of risk and margin models, we will discuss the backtesting approaches that may help to progress on some topics there, and if addressed together, the margin models has to go hand in hand with backtesting approaches, and also with the approaches to measure procyclicality of the margins. And last but not least, out of the main topics, we will also work on the volatility controls within price volatility controls within, and that's on the matter between trading venue and clearinghouse. So a few topics that were inspired by happening in not so recent past in one of the CCPs, and related to the energy development, or not energy, the developments in the commodity markets. So we will discuss it, and we have the presentation very widely covered and broadly covered by different players in the industry, and different market participants, or different types of market participants, and will provide recommendation. So the outcome of the work will be a report which we will compile, align, and review. Yeah. I would stop here if there are any questions for Chris. Then
thanks, Dimitri. Alessandro, do you want to walk through recovery and resolution?
Thank you, Chris. So if we could move to the next slide. This is work stream 2, recovery and resolution. So the action plan for the Recovery and Resolution workstream is articulated along three main areas of focus. First, we will examine public comments on the CFTC proposed rulemaking on DCO recovery and orderly wind down plans and information for resolution planning. We will identify key themes from these comments and determine whether to make any recommendations to the Commission and the staff. Second, we will review other recovery and resolution models from a national and international perspective, and we will be mindful of the differences between DCOs and other types of entities. We will look for common themes and lessons learned. And finally, we will look at national and international frameworks for recovery and resolution of CCPs and examine opportunities for harmonization of rules where necessary. And again, we will determine whether to make any recommendations to the Commission and the staff. Chris, back to you.
Thanks, Alessandro. And I share the technology and operations. Our action plan is we want to look at the critical juncture of third and fourth parties and how they may be impacted or impact the core principles from the CFTC. We want to look at those future events and how we respond to those as an industry on a go-forward basis, again, within the core principles and in the regulation that exists today, or make recommendations for future recommendations for new regulation going forward. And specifically within system safeguards, how do we identify the use of cloud technologies and impacting the current CFTC regulations and seek to identify potential enhancements as we go forward? Certainly a lot of activity around the cloud, less certainty around how they fit in the current level of regulation and where they may head in the future. We also want to talk about the use of the historical reasons legal entity identifiers were not mandated by CFTC regulation. We've had some conversation with staff and those who have a better memory of this, and we think this bringing this to light is going to be an important function on a go-forward basis, especially after considering some of the benefits they may have provided during recent market disruptions. And then actually, if that is a path that we choose to travel and make a recommendation, what implications that may mean on a go-forward basis, not only to the staff at the CFTC, but most importantly to the market as a whole. And that's what our initial game plan will be. And unless there are questions for us, I think that is the overview of our three work streams and the issues we've identified to date. And what we will begin working on in earnest here shortly. Chairman Emeritus,
so Chris, Chris, sorry, just to jump in, just wanted to give a sense of what we plan to do in terms of output from the subcommittee. So just to conclude, we plan to have initial workstream progress reports at the in-person MRAC meeting that's due to take place in the fall at a date to be announced. And we aim to develop initial workstream recommendations by the third quarter of next year. And that concludes our remarks. Chris, unless we have anything else, we'll hand it over to Chair Crichton.
That's where I was headed. Thanks for the clarification.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris, Alessandro, and Dimitri. I think that was very helpful. Now I'll open it up to the floor to the MRAC members for discussion. Marilee, I'll just confirm with you to make sure that we don't have any hands raised or discussion points before we move on. Is that correct? Okay.
Good morning. Good morning, Alicia. This is Commissioner Johnson. I just want to share, Marilee was having some technical difficulties. We've had a few at the start of the meeting this morning. So hopefully, if there is a hand raised, someone could come off mute in the next couple of seconds. Otherwise, thanks so much, Alicia, for thoughtfully considering whether there might be feedback from the membership.
Sure. It looks like I do see a hand raised from Marnie, so we'll recognize Marnie.
Thanks, Alicia. I just wanted to make a couple of comments. So first of all, JP Morgan commends Commissioner Johnson as CFTC Commissioner Sponsor and Alicia Crichton as the MRAC Chair for reestablishing the CFTC CCP Risk and Governance Subcommittee to prioritize and continue the work on enhancing CCP risk management. The focus area of the work streams are very pertinent considering the ongoing work on CCP resolution as well as the challenges that the industry has faced in recent times, be it technology and operational issues or the market volatility across rates and commodities in particular over the last couple of years, impacting margin requirements and liquidity. To this end, we welcome the priorities of the work streams and in particular, the margin and collateral work stream, which seeks to address margin procyclicality and improve disclosure on margin models to market participants. Both of these areas represent unfinished business from the prior work undertaken by the subcommittee in 2020 and 2021, which culminated in a set of margin recommendations and highlighted participant views on enhanced disclosures and anti-procyclicality measures. So it is important that the work stream revisit and refresh the work already accomplished by the subcommittee previously and ensure that the 6 actionable recommendations are revisited that were developed by the subcommittee and can be translated into CFTC rulemaking. And I also want to really thank Chris Edmonds and Alessandra Coco in particular for leading the subcommittee. I know you both well, and I know you guys are going to do a really great job. And I look forward to seeing the progress over the coming months. So thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Marnie. We'll just pause for a few more seconds if there's anyone else that would like to make a comment. Okay, well, I don't see any other hands raised. Apologies if I've missed you. Please do get in touch with us separately if we have missed you. But if it's okay, we'll move along to the revised second section of the meeting agenda, which now relates to the Market Structure Subcommittee. This subcommittee has met and had productive discussions concerning anticipated work streams. We'll now hear from Biz Chatterjee of Citigroup, who is co-chair of this subcommittee. He will focus on the subcommittee's forward-looking work streams. Biz, please feel free to begin.
Good morning, Commissioner Johnson, Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero, Commissioner Merzinger, and Commissioner Pham, and to my fellow MRAC members and for others that have joined this meeting. My name is Biz Chatterjee. I'm a Managing Director and Head of Innovation for the Treasury and Trade Services Division at Citigroup. Along with Ann Battle from ISDA, I'm the co-chair of the Market Structure Subcommittee. Over the last 2 weeks, subcommittees had productive meetings during which we've discussed critical issues on which the subcommittee will focus in both the near and the long term. Based on member input and feedback from industry participants, we've developed 4 work streams coming out of those discussions. I'd like to provide an update on those planned work streams today. The 4 work streams will cover issues that are expected to impact the functioning of the CFTC supervised products and markets. These relate to block trade thresholds for CEF markets, FCM capacity for cleared products, proposed changes to Treasury bond-related markets, and post-trade risk reduction services, or PTRR. In the coming weeks, the subcommittee will further refine the scope of these work streams, both along short and long-term time horizons. First, starting with the topic of block implementation rules. As discussed previously in the March 2023 MRAC meeting, new block thresholds and cap sizes are set to effect for MAT swaps on December 4th. Block sizes that are not calibrated appropriately may adversely impact the ability of market participants to efficiently execute certain large size notional swaps and may impact the general liquidity and functioning of the OTC markets. We are considering a near-term analysis of the impact of these new thresholds which may involve analysis of data from CEFs and other market participants, as well as from the CFTC database itself. As part of this work, we may also analyze the impact of reporting delays and the time it takes for market participants to execute hedges. Continuing on the work of the IBOR Transition Risk Subcommittee, we may consider long-term block recommendations for the new SOFR swap trading markets as part of this analysis. On the second work stream related to FCM industry structure and capacity, we note the various anecdotal references to the fact that the number of FCMs offering clearing intermediary services to end users has significantly decreased over the last decade, coinciding with the move to mandatory clearing for most OTC derivatives and the need to clear a larger number of products and volumes. We expect to analyze barriers to entry, which could come from capital requirements, customer account requirements, and technology requirements, and weigh those against the role that FCMs play in risk mitigation. The subcommittee may consider potential recommendations within the existing FCM models and other possible longer-term recommendations for enhancing that model, especially during times of an FCM default, and how a framework for a bridge FCM akin to a bridge bank could or may be used in this analysis. On the third work stream related to Treasury bond markets, last September, the SEC proposed rules that would require members of a clearing agency that today voluntarily clear certain bond trades to clear all such transactions. Currently, the only registered clearing agency for such transactions is the FICC. While more work must be done to narrow this work stream's focus beyond the general topic of additional clearing of US transactions, we expect to analyze how these requirements on clearing US Treasuries may affect CFTC regulated markets, which may include an assessment of client clearing models, cross-margining practices, and the use of Treasury products as collateral for derivatives and margin posting. The last topic the subcommittee will look to address is PTRR, or post-trade risk reduction. PTRR services play a critical role in elimination of various aspects of credit, counterparty, and operational risks from trades that have been previously executed and or cleared markets. Market participants and policymakers in the UK and EU are discussing exemptions from clearing and trading requirements that may incentivize additional risk and liquidity management using PTRR services. This fourth work stream would seek to analyze the implications of a potential CFTC exception, leveraging work already done in other jurisdictions. We've already received a great deal of interest from subcommittee members with respect to these topics, and we expect to organize the launch of these work streams shortly. At present, we anticipate such work stream will hold individual meetings to further define their scope, plan out objectives and deliverables, discuss and analyze, and plan out recommendation. We expect that the block size, FCM capacity, and PTRR work streams will begin meeting shortly, and will plan and then seek to achieve near-term objectives as well as potentially longer-term objectives for the FCM capacity work stream. We expect that the scope of the Treasury market work stream will be a much longer one, probably reaching into 2024, but we will aim to frame out the relevant issues for the work stream in the near term. To the extent the areas of focus covered by these work streams may coincide with work stream of other CFTC committees, we will seek to have open lines of communication with our counterpart subcommittees and their sponsors to ensure that we are covering unique aspects of these critical issues and maximizing the expertise from our subcommittee members. Finally, on behalf of our subcommittee, Ann and I would like to thank our sponsor, Commissioner Johnson, the designated MRAC staff, and our MRAC chair and colleagues for the opportunity to present our work today. We look forward to the further engagement we will have and the contributions we will make as we carry forward our work on these important issues. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Biz. I will now open it up to the MRAC members for discussion. I'll give it just another few seconds to see if there's any hands that come up in the chat.
Alicia, if you can hear me, it's Marilee. I don't see any further hands up yet in the chat.
Okay, that's great. Thanks a lot, Marilee. So now I think we can turn to the third section of the revised agenda, which is interest rate benchmark reform. To begin this section, we'll hear a pre-recorded presentation from one of IRBR's former co-chairs, Ann Battle from ISDA.
Hi, my name is Ann Battle, and I'm the current co-chair of the MRAC's Interest Rate Benchmark Reform Subcommittee. Today's presentation is going to cover the efforts and success of this subcommittee between 2018 and earlier this year. Before moving to the subcommittee's work, I want to thank all of the subcommittee members for their time and efforts over a short time period in a variety of diverse work streams. Many of these people have moved on, but the final 3 pages of today's presentation, which will have a permanent home on the CFTC's website, includes their names and firms so that their work can be celebrated for many years. Members of this subcommittee included many people who are on the ARC as well, serving double duty, including public sector ARC members. David Bowman in particular must have more hours in his day than the rest of us because he served on this subcommittee while leading countless ARC working groups as well. Very importantly, I would also like to thank now Chairman Benham, who formed the Interest Rate Benchmark Reform Subcommittee when he was a commissioner and sponsor of the MRAC. Now Chair Benham successfully navigated a meaningful role for this subcommittee alongside the already existing ARC sponsored by the Federal Reserve. As I will come on to, the subcommittee's work provided a valuable supplement to the ARC's work in the derivatives markets in particular. Similarly, an enormous thanks to Commissioner Johnson for recognizing the value of the Interest Rate Benchmark Reform Subcommittee in the final stages of the transition away from US dollar LIBOR and for very ably bringing this work to a successful conclusion. I also want to thank Alicia Lewis, who served as the federal officer for the subcommittee under now Chair Benham, and is the behind-the-scenes reason that the subcommittee was able to do so much in a very short time and in sometimes contentious situations. I think that Alicia was a power behind every single call, email, and deliverable. Recently, Lillian Cardona graciously stepped into this role and continued Alicia's hard work. Thanks are also due to Matt Oakes from Morgan Stanley, who was not technically a subcommittee member, but who provided expertise and support also behind the scenes in connection with all of the subcommittee's deliverables. Before moving on to thank the subcommittee's original chair, Tom Whiff, I also want to thank Sandy O'Connor, who was chair of the ARC when the MRAC formed the Interest Rate Benchmark Reform Subcommittee. Sandy was instrumental in shaping the partnership between the subcommittee and the ARC and ensuring that the work of the two was complementary. Sandy led the ARC through the selection of SOFR before SOFR even existed or had a name, and saw the ARC through to SOFR's publication by the New York Fed as an IOSCO-compliant benchmark less than a year later. And finally, the most important part of this presentation is to thank Tom Witt, who chaired this subcommittee for almost 5 years. Tom took on this role to split the work with Sandy, but then, as we all know, he soon took on double duty when Sandy retired from JP Morgan, and Tom succeeded her as ARC chair alongside his duties to this subcommittee. Since Tom recently moved on from Morgan Stanley and his many roles in shaping the transition away from LIBOR, countless kind, thoughtful, and absolutely well-deserved words have been shared by senior officials and others across the financial markets. I won't pretend to be able to compete with or add to the eloquence of these words. However, this presentation would not be complete without a huge thanks to Tom for chairing the subcommittee and the ARC, as well as serving as an ISDA board member throughout the critical years of the transition away from LIBOR. His support has truly been invaluable, and the last few weeks would not have gone as smoothly as they did without him. I also want to add my personal thanks to Tom for supporting me as an individual throughout this work. When I think back on all of our many calls, meetings, and discussions over the last several years, what immediately comes to mind is the number of times Tom asked me, how can I help or what can I do to help? And that is how Tom approached the transition away from LIBOR generally. He was first and foremost there to help the industry and the public sector overcome every single obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it seems. Tom exemplifies leadership and professionalism, and I hope I can apply a fraction of this to my future work. And now on, finally, to the next slide and to the substance of the Interest Rate Benchmark Reform Subcommittee's work. As I think is clear by now, the subcommittee was formed to ensure and help a smooth transition to SOFR in the U.S. derivatives markets. The subcommittee increased awareness of SOFR and of the end of LIBOR. The subcommittee ensured that the work required to transition to SOFR did not meet any hurdles associated with regulations coming out of Title VII of the Dodd-Frank Act. The subcommittee was very involved, as we'll come on to, in increasing use of SOFR in derivatives contracts. And the subcommittee also supported CCP transitions that were critical to the derivatives markets. Going to the next slide. A key success of the Interest Rate Benchmark Reform Subcommittee was its SOFR First recommendation. Within the first week of SOFR First, the interdealer linear swap market share for SOFR swaps grew from 0% to almost 80%. In a minute, we'll cover some more data in detail, but I think that figure is very impactful and should be celebrated as critical to bringing SOFR to where it is today. SOFR First was something that the Interest Rate Benchmark Reform Subcommittee derived from a similar SONIA First initiative in the UK, demonstrating not just the subcommittee's good work with other bodies in the US, but with bodies focusing on the transition away from LIBOR globally. The second row here talks about the CCP discounting transition exercise. As mentioned, this subcommittee played a role in CCP's efforts to transition away from LIBOR. And in particular, in June of 2020, virtually at the height of COVID, this subcommittee hosted an almost all-day tabletop exercise that provided invaluable insight and recommendations to ensure that the CCP's move to SOFR discounting and price alignment interest was quite successful later that year in October of 2020. Another initiative of the subcommittee, which seems silly at this time, but I think was very important, was plain English standard disclosures to help people understand what SOFR is. Now we talk a lot about SOFR, but when the subcommittee was formed in 2018, these disclosures were quite helpful to market participants who needed to spread the word regarding the fact that LIBOR was ending and SOFR was the future. Moving on to the next slide. This slide covers in a bit more detail the SOFR First initiatives, which the subcommittee divided into 3 stages, starting with linear interest rate swaps, and that's the phase that had the huge impact I mentioned before. Moving on to interdealer cross-currency swaps, and then interdealer nonlinear swaps, and finally, the last phase of the initiative was for exchange-traded derivatives. And given the breadth of participants in this market, the subcommittee pivoted to publication of a user guide for these products as more practical than a formal recommendation for interdealer trading. CME then followed with their own initiative, which successfully did transfer behavior in this market to SOFR. So finally, if we move to the next slide. This shows data provided to us from the ISDA Claris risk-free rate adoption indicator. This first slide shows exchange traded and OTC derivatives, cleared OTC derivatives. And if you look at the angles of the orange line, you'll see the sharp increases in connection with each of the first 3 phases of SOFR first. This is even more apparent on the next slide, which isolates just the cleared OTC trading in SOFR compared to other benchmarks. And then finally, this slide breaks apart the exchange traded exposure to SOFR. And if you look, the CME's initiative was between June 2022 and August 2022, and you see the significant increases over that time period. This presentation, as I mentioned, will have a permanent home on the CFTC's website. The next slide contains links to related actions by the CFTC itself to ensure a smooth transition away from US dollar LIBOR, and in many cases, implement work of the Interest Rate Benchmark Reform Subcommittee. And then finally, as I mentioned, the last 3 slides contain the names of all of the people who either for the full 5 years or for a portion of that time served on the subcommittee. I encourage all of you to take a look at this presentation, to take a look at the other materials, and finally, I want to congratulate the entire industry, including the CFTC, the MRAC, the subcommittee, the ARC, and all market participants for the successful transition away from US dollar LIBOR. And thank you once again to Commissioner Johnson for the opportunity to present today.
Great. Well, thank you to Anne for that presentation, and her contribution to this subcommittee, as well as all of the other IRBR members, is greatly appreciated. Before opening to the MRAC members for discussion, I'll hand over to Commissioner Johnson for some comments.
Thanks so much, Alicia. I want to just share how tremendously grateful I am to sponsor the Market Risk Advisory Committee. At the outset of the meeting and throughout the meeting, we have heard acknowledgement of Chair Benham during his leadership of MRAC and his launch of the IRBR subcommittee. I want to appreciate his thoughtfulness and acknowledge what is truly a crowning achievement, I believe, in our industry that illustrates cooperation and coordination across multiple regulators, multiple market participants with diverse interests and perspectives, and for the benefit of the public and the integrity of our markets. So if I could just share a few comments and remarks here before we open the floor to member discussion, I would be very grateful. I want to acknowledge in the immediate moment, as we just witnessed, the exceptional expertise of Ann Battle, Senior Counsel, Market Transitions, and Head of Benchmark Reform at the International Swaps and Derivatives Association. She has co-chaired the Interest Rate Benchmark Reform Subcommittee under my sponsorship with the very able, and I'll say more about him in just a moment, Tom With. What I'd like to comment on here, I mentioned at the outset of the meeting, is that IRBR's multi-year effort to support the transition away from LIBOR to risk-free rates, specifically in the context of U.S., the adoption and development of the U.S. SOFR and SOFR first are worthy of celebration. Just 1 week ago, the remaining 5 USD LIBOR settings ceased to be published on a representative basis. I'd like to recognize the significant work in the last few years by the IRBR to build momentum and a safe, smooth transition to this new these alternative risk-free rates. I'd also like to acknowledge the exceptional support for the IRBR subcommittee that has come over the last several years. When IRBR was launched in July of 2018 and through the beginning of my service as a commissioner, Alicia Lewis, special counsel to Chair Benham, who served as DFO for IRBR, helped, as Ann described, to shepherd this process along. Today, I'm grateful to benefit from the support of Lillian Cardona, who was among the first lawyers to serve as counsel in my office as a commissioner. I'll say more about that at the end of the meeting, but I thank Alicia and Lillian tremendously for their support and service. The success of IRBR is also due to its leadership and membership. I'd like to extend my appreciation to Tom With, former vice chair of Morgan Stanley, who was central to guiding the work of IRBR. In addition to his role with the IRBR, Tom also served as chair of the Alternative Reference Rate Committee, the ARC, a group of private market participants convened by the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I also wish to celebrate with co-chair With his own transition very recently from Morgan Stanley, where he served for nearly 3 decades. Similarly, I recognize Ann's work and leadership, as I said at the outset of my remarks, as well as the efforts of every member over the course of the several years that we led IRBR from beginning to today. Finally, I'd like to recognize that there have been members of the CFTC staff from diverse divisions and different areas who supported this transition. In particular, the CFTC staff has issued no action letters and noticed proposed and final rulemakings to facilitate the market's transition to SOFR. This multi-year global effort to transition away from LIBOR to SOFR will serve as a case study for successful public-private partnership to address an orderly transition away from LIBOR. The result of this exemplary public-private global effort has been an orderly transition from LIBOR. We've witnessed alignment across our markets, in particular with respect to over-the-counter uncleared and cleared markets, as well as exchange-traded derivatives markets. This is worthy of celebration, and it's worthy of taking time to appreciate and acknowledge the tremendous time, the significant talent, and all of the thoughtfulness that was poured into the success of IRBR. Thank you to all of you so very much. You have our deepest gratitude. I am not sure that I'm allowed to speak on behalf of my fellow commissioners, but I'll at least speak on behalf of others who sponsored the MRAC and those who have supported the IRBR subcommittee from its inception to date. We are grateful for your efforts and thankful for your service. Thank you so much, Chair Crichton.
Great. Thank you very much, Commissioner. We'll now open the floor for member discussion. So if you can raise a hand via the chat, and we'll pause a few seconds for that. Okay, at the moment, I don't see any hands raised, so we'll continue to move forward. For our newest 2 subcommittees, the Future of Finance and Climate-Related Market Risk, we'll hear presentations by 2 expert panels followed by member discussion. I'll now introduce the speakers for our first roundtable on the future of finance. We'll allow for 25 minutes of presentations followed by 15 minutes of discussion. We had insightful speakers at the March 8th meeting, including the Director of the Securities Exchange Commission's Director of the Strategic Hub for Innovation and Financial Technology, the Director of the DOJ's National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Task Force, Department of Justice, public interest groups, and former CFTC Chairman Tim Massad, as well as insights from industry innovators. I'm pleased to welcome our distinguished speakers for today. Alessandro Cocco, Vice President and Head of Financial Markets Group, Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Alessandro will be moderating. Rebecca Rettig, Chief Policy Officer, Polygon Labs. Yisha Yadav, Associate Dean and Milton R. Underwood Chair and Professor of Law, Vanderbilt University Law School. Stephen L. Schwartz, Stanley A. Starr Distinguished Professor of Law, Duke University Law School. Jason Allegrante, Chief Legal and Compliance Officer, Fireblocks, and Chen Arad, Chief External Affairs Officer, Solidus Labs. Alessandro, over to you.
Thank you, Chair Crichton, and thank you, Commissioner Johnson, for sponsoring this timely roundtable, and CFTC staff for supporting the important work of the Commission in this area. And thank you to our distinguished guests for sharing your insights today. The digital assets economy bears the promise of more efficient markets, reducing transaction costs and enabling retail customers as well as professional trading firms to transfer value efficiently across jurisdictions and trade digital assets against each other and against traditional finance assets. This new economy offers the opportunity to create wealth for those who have not had access to financial markets in the past, but with this opportunity comes a heightened risk. In some cases, clients may not have access to their funds when they need them, and unscrupulous actors can attempt to engage in money laundering or insider trading. In the past couple of years, notable failures in digital assets markets have highlighted the need for protection of customer assets in this emerging sector. On the other hand, during the past few crises, we have witnessed the resilience of derivatives markets, which leads me to this question: what are the lessons learned from derivative markets that can be valuable as we continue building the infrastructure for digital assets? Some of the rules that make our derivatives markets reliable and liquid are effective rules for the custody of digital assets and segregation of client and house assets so that they're protected from theft and recoverable even after the failure of the custodian. Adequate disclosures, rules governing anti-manipulation and conflict of interest, sound risk management practices, and rules prohibiting market manipulation and fraud. How would these rules work in the context of digital assets? Some of the digital assets offerings are based around the non-intermediated structure, where the client accesses the clearinghouse directly rather than through an intermediary. These non-intermediated structures may also involve the vertical integration of separate functions within trading and execution, such as exchange, clearinghouse, and custodian. In May of last year, CFTC Chair Benham and CFTC staff, together with staff from the Financial Markets Group at the Chicago Fed, hosted a roundtable on non-intermediation. We have also examined these topics at the 2022 Fall Conference of the Financial Markets Group at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, where Commissioner Johnson was our keynote speaker. We held a fireside chat with Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero, and we hosted a panel of insightful market participants, and that happened just a few days after the failure of FTX. In the FSOC report on digital asset financial stability risks and regulation published in October 2022, FSOC recommended that member agencies assess the impact of vertical integration on conflicts of interest and market volatility, and whether vertically integrated market structures can or should be accommodated under existing laws and regulations. In May of this year, the CFTC's Division of Clearing and Risk issued a staff advisory on the risks associated with the expansion of DCO clearing of digital assets. The advisory focused on system safeguards requirements, conflicts of interest, and physical delivery of digital assets. On the same day, Commissioner Johnson issued a public statement calling for the CFTC to initiate a rulemaking process for CFTC-registered DCOs engaged in crypto or digital asset clearing activities, calling for proposed rules on conflict of interest, custody and client asset protection, operational and technological risks, specifically cyber risks, and market manipulation and fraud. In June of this year, CFTC staff released a request for comment on the impact of affiliations on certain CFTC-regulated entities. The staff is seeking comments on the impact of an affiliation between an intermediary or other market participant and a DCM, DCO, or SEF with respect to supervisory responsibilities, anti-competitive effects, treatment on non-public information, and the adequacy of applicable financial resources. We also addressed these topics at a fireside chat with Commissioner Johnson and Commissioner Merzinger at the CCP conference that took place in Frankfurt in June, co-sponsored by the Chicago Fed with the European Central Bank and the Bundesbank. So this work is ongoing, and policymakers need input from the industry to ensure that the new rules that apply to the digital assets markets are thoughtful and address the specific needs of these markets and the stakeholders participating in them. So what can policymakers do to enable the public to access the new economy while protecting them from the next crisis and from unscrupulous actors? What can we learn from the rules governing derivative markets today, and what new rules do policymakers need to take into account to address the specific characteristics of this economy? So we will hear today from experts in this area. Commissioner Johnson and Chair Crichton have kindly introduced the panel earlier today, so I'll hand it over to Rebecca Reddick, Chief Policy Officer at Polygon Labs.
Thank you so much, Alessandro. Many thanks to Commissioner Johnson for convening today's meeting, to the members of the MRAC, and to the other esteemed speakers on this panel, which I have the privilege of joining. And also thank you to us, Alessandro, for framing today's discussion. Your last question actually perfectly frames my brief remarks today, which I will take in two parts. Your last question is, what can we learn from the tried and tested rules governing derivatives markets, part one, and what new rules do policymakers need to take into account to address the specific characteristics of this new economy? To answer the first question, the tried and tested rules governing derivative markets today, we can answer simply that the laws and rules governing these markets arose as a reaction to the construction of the market itself and not the other way around. So put simply, the laws for derivatives and future markets, and also the securities markets, but separately, has been reactive to the traditional financial markets and not vice versa. So we should not conflate the existing frameworks that we have in these markets for a deliberate policy choice that was done to optimize all the various policy trade-offs we have, which I will get to in a moment. These laws were based on historical developments and then modified over time in order to ensure good consumer protection and also the integrity of our markets and financial stability. And so if you were building what the derivatives laws would look like from scratch, it may not actually look exactly like it does today. Just because the future markets work one way does not mean it's necessarily the right way to do it, but it is what we have become accustomed to. The statutes were not designed because a law professor, an economist, or a regulator necessarily considered the optimal way to structure the laws for the derivatives markets and then built them that way. There were existing structures, for example, exchanges being mutually owned by its members that were codified into law with additional rules and safeguards to protect customers under that structure. This is essentially the same with respect to how clearing has developed in the derivatives markets as well. So what did that tell us about how to build out laws for our crypto asset derivatives and other markets? I think there are two paths in front of us in terms of regulating the crypto asset markets and figuring out how to build these laws and rules. One is to use existing laws and rules and make companies running crypto asset trading venues fit into those rules. And the other may be to do what occurred with the traditional derivatives markets, where the existing structures were codified into law with very important guardrails and modifications made over time to enhance consumer protections and ensure market integrity. Before I note what I think necessarily will work about how to regulate these markets, I think it's important to underscore that we are in a critical moment and that we have a unique, potentially generational opportunity to step back and consider exactly what rules and regulations we can implement today to ensure that the tripartite regulatory goals of consumer protection, market integrity, and combating illicit finance are met. We do not have extraordinary amounts of time to do this. So when I say step back, I don't mean necessarily take a deep breath. The crypto asset markets, notwithstanding the deep reputational step backs of 2022, continue to grow, and we must act decisively and swiftly. So the question is whether we take the first or the second path. On Friday, former CFTC Chair Tim Massad advocated for the second path, the using traditional laws, in a Wall Street Journal op-ed co-authored with former SEC Chair Jay Clayton. There, Mr. Massad and Mr. Clayton championed the SEC and CFTC to, quote, jointly develop basic investor and market protection standards for trading platforms as they exist today. The agencies could act directly or through a self-regulatory organization, shifting funding responsibility to the industry. The second path in some ways makes sense because it is what occurred with the derivatives markets previously. Take the system that's developed and implement the critical guardrails within that system. There is one point I'd like to highlight before we get to the second part of Alessandro's question, and as we consider how to regulate the future of our financial markets as it comes to crypto asset trading venues, but we can't paint all companies or trading platforms with the same brush when we step back to consider whether we take the first or the second path forward. Some of the greater failures or collapses of 2022 are not a reflection of the functions of crypto assets more broadly. Rather, they highlight the same types of failures we have seen time and again in the traditional financial markets: subjective judgment that leads to unspeakably poor risk management decisions, or things like fraud. And we actually know how to regulate those types of issues. And so in some ways, that counsels for the first path, which is use the existing laws and rules and make companies running crypto asset trading venues fit into those. So I think that's important to think about from just a long-term perspective as well, is that we may need a hybrid between the first and second paths as we build out laws and regulations for these crypto asset trading venues. The second part to Alessandro's last question is, what new rules do policymakers need to take into account to address the specific characteristics of this new economy? So to answer this part of the question as it applies to the main issue we're addressing today, vertical integration, it's important to denote that there are at least 3 different types of vertical integration that exist within derivatives financial markets today. And I will do these very quickly because I know we're very close to time for me. But one is someone who's operating a market and exchange and also a trading firm on the exchange. That is probably the greatest place where conflicts of issues arise. Conflicts of interest issues arise. That's happened time and again. And that is where we should be focused on the vertical integration question. Where you should, then the second part of vertical integration is, should you be allowed to integrate customer-facing brokerage activity with the operating of the trading platform? Obviously, that raises 2 issues, some of which are conflict of interest to the extent that an asset trades in multiple places. If a customer is trusting the exchange to give the best price, you don't want the broker to be able to game the system. So that's also very important. And the other issue that arises in traditional derivatives markets is whether you have the capital of the intermediary backstopping the trading of its customers versus the customers coming to the exchange directly. In the crypto asset markets and spot crypto exchanges, where you don't allow margin trading, everything is done on a fully funded basis. And so this type of issue or interest does not really come into play. And then clearinghouses and exchanges, which is a competition issue and not a conflicts of interest issue. So as we're figuring out this hybrid, maybe between the first and the second path forward, we need to be very, very mindful that vertical integration, which I think has really become synonymous these days with something like necessarily trading against your customers or conflicts of interest or fraud, we actually break out the different types of vertical integration and make sure we are regulating as opposed to those versus some other broad category of what we view as problematic from a vertical integration perspective.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that contribution. So with that, I hand it over to Yesha Yadav, Associate Dean and Milton R. Underwood Chair and Professor of Law at Vanderbilt University Law School.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much to Commissioner Johnson. Thank you so very much to the CFTC, the MRAC, and my wonderful distinguished panelists for this extraordinary honor and privilege to get to speak on an issue of enormous urgency, of enormous complexity, as well as clearly, as Rebecca outlined, just huge amounts of importance for crypto market structure. As Alessandro pointed to at the top of the panel, vertical integration has become just an incredibly pressing and urgent issue following obviously the FTX debacle, that of other firms like Celsius, Voyager, BlockFi, Genesis Global, and others that folded multiple financial functions into single entities or closely affiliated entities. Now, quite apart from the wrongdoing that has been alleged in the case of FTX, we saw clearly just the horrific costs and consequences that have followed from the fallout of a hyper-centralized trading firm in the crypto markets for the larger crypto economy as a whole. And so, thinking through, some of the statistics here that we're all familiar with, clearly, the FTX debacle has been extremely costly for the cryptocurrency industry. So millions of creditors around the world are suffering enormous economic hardship. I believe the figure was something like 9 million creditors. In addition, legal fees, advisory fees are somewhere in the ballpark of around $200 million for around 6 months worth of work. Now, certainly that points to the huge complexity of the issues at hand, as Rebecca sort of detailed just earlier, but equally it highlights the fact that we're dealing with potentially very eroded recoveries down the line, particularly for the unsecured creditors, many of whom are likely to be the FTX customers who are sort of extremely vulnerable from the standpoint of their own sort of economic well-being. So clearly the costs and consequences here potentially are horrific. This is a very strange set of affairs for many folks looking at this picture, particularly given the decentralizing ethos that underlies crypto market structure. The cryptocurrency markets today are home to some of the most centralizing firms anywhere in the financial system. So cryptocurrency exchanges, most notably, fold multiple different functions within their organization. Cryptocurrency exchanges, for example, provide, as we know, customer onboarding directly without necessarily having to go through brokerages, for example, order matching, clearing and settlement, custody, certainly in some cases, market making, as well as some more esoteric activities, for example, like venture investing in others. Now, in many ways, this highly hyper-centralized model has made them extremely successful extremely quickly. But it has also made sure that they have been at the forefront of popularizing and mass marketing cryptocurrency markets for average folks across the marketplace over the last sort of 5 years or so. And so the hyper-centralizing model has been super useful for the exchanges themselves, but it's also been essential for making sure that crypto has acquired the popular appeal and become the kind of conversation starter that we know and that we're talking about today. Now, in this context, most normal people, as we can sort of imagine, are not going to be super comfortable transacting on underlying blockchains. Many of them are not going to be comfortable with things like self-custody, for example, self-protection. They may not be comfortable with probabilistic, slow, potentially high fees involved in direct settlement on many blockchains. And so in that context, cryptocurrency exchanges have provided a number of very important solutions to sort of deal with these frictions. For example, liquidity is that much greater in cryptocurrency markets. Finding a counterparty is much easier. Clearing and settlement happens instantaneously on the books of the exchange off-chain, right? This is a huge facility for folks that are worried about potentially not having the orders picked up when the blockchain is particularly busy, or paying high fees, for example, in that context. In addition, when we think about, custody can be professionalized. This might give confidence to folks that may not feel comfortable holding on to their own passwords and so forth. In addition, obviously, market making for the firms that provide it has kind of grown up as a function of the fact that these markets are very new, that the crypto markets are new with a limited trading history. These are markets that operate 24/7, 365 days a year, often on weekends. Now, statistics are very clear that liquidity drops off on weekends as folks go home for their weekends. As financial firms are not providing funding for trading and so forth, the liquidity drops back. And so having market makers present in that context can be potentially helpful. In addition, obviously, exchanges are often seeing a litany of brand new coins come into this space for which intermediation is hard to provide. Demand can be ad hoc and idiosyncratic, and so exchanges can feel compelled themselves to take the other side of the bargain, right? So, these are functions that are peculiar and different and novel to the crypto asset class, and they're peculiar, different, and novel to the cryptocurrency market as a whole. Now, Rebecca talked about some of the sort of hybrid nature of the regulation that we're looking at. And here what we're seeing is a market that has evolved without the usual guardrails that we see in traditional markets today, right? These are markets that have grown up without the constraints to advise on what kind of practices are potentially okay versus what kind of practices are potentially extremely risky. For example, using your balance sheet in order to provide markets for potentially highly novel, hard to value assets, right? And so in this context, we're dealing with a market structure that has evolved in a peculiar way, in an odd way, that has some certain facets that are commonly seen in traditional markets, but it also diverges from traditional markets in key ways. For example, in relation to clearing and settlement, in relation to the bearer nature of the asset, in relation to the fact that there's certain kind of novel practices that engage with the underlying blockchains, for example, like staking. So the question is, how do we think about our regulatory approaches here? So Rebecca outlined sort of some of the different options here, but another one to really think about is how to think about these risks in a more dynamic fashion. Now, traditionally, in our own sort of normal, sort of default way of thinking, as it were, we are thinking about things in silos, right? Here's a clearinghouse, here's an exchange, here's a brokerage firm. This is how we regulate and think about their risks. Here we have a clearinghouse, so therefore we have to think about initial margin, variation margin, default fund. Does the waterfall work? Are the member eligibility criteria functioning and fair, and making sure that only the best and most well-equipped actors can join the clearinghouse? In the context of a cryptocurrency intermediary, however, we have to think about these risks in a much less siloed fashion. In other words, the risks are dynamic. The risk from one function can certainly impact that of another. So for example, an exchange that is providing custody as well as market making can see an interaction between these two functions in novel ways. So for example, if it suffers a shock to its custodial function, for example, through a hack, that might create selling pressure on the part of customers, that would then ensure that its market making functions can come under strain, whereas balance sheet has to then deal with the demand of customers looking to sell and get out of their positions. In addition, a firm like FTX, for example, that engaged in a great deal of proprietary investment. In that context, obviously, investments can go wrong. That can scare customers. Customers may want to get their assets out. And provided the custodial functions, and if the custodial functions are not up to snuff, as we saw in the case of FTX, there may well be trouble that grows as a result of it. So the risks here are operating in a much more interactive way than we're used to seeing. And so the question is, how do we engage with that and deal with that through a regulatory framework that is tailored and mindful to those risks? In addition, Rebecca mentioned conflicts of interest. How do we think about governance in this space where the risks of vertical integration are dynamic and interactive? What kind of separations are going to be workable here? Can we workably separate? How do we workably separate custody, for example, from trading? In that context, if an exchange is providing custodial staking, hot wallets, and other kinds of facilities, how do we deal with separation in that context? How do we think about it functionally? How do we think about it from the corporate governance standpoint? And coming to questions of corporate governance, what kind of qualifications do we want to see from those who are overseeing and part of the front lines of safeguarding the markets from within these organizations? What kind of qualifications do we want to see in the directors and officers? What kind of qualifications do we want to see in the legal and compliance to ensure that they are not just good at the basic governance, but also understand the technological vulnerabilities that they're dealing with? These are large questions, as Rebecca sort of pointed to the fact that, these are sort of deep structural questions that we need to think about, and addressing them is going to take time. But we have, some deep need for urgent reform here to address the obvious vulnerabilities that clients are facing. Now, Commissioner Johnson is leading here in sort of providing this call to action to think about rules with respect to custody, with respect to disclosure, and so forth. And this really needs to be a potential approach going forward to at least have 2 or 3 immediate milestones that we can reach to provide safety and security to consumers. First and foremost, how do we get custodial rules in place to make sure that customer assets are safe? That has to be the overarching priority here from a policy standpoint, right? The market, honest actors in the market can do so much, but without the legal certainty in place, those efforts are likely to fall short. In addition, having disclosure rules come into play that are workable and that respond to the technological needs and requirements of this market is obviously key. And I'd point to the work of my wonderful co-author and friend, Chris Brummer, who has written extensively about the need to have, technological disclosures that are easily understood by the average public that is now engaging with the crypto marketplace from different kind of product lines. In addition, obviously thinking through an idea that I've written about elsewhere in relation to SROs, self-regulatory organizations like the CME, for example, New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ. Can we bring that kind of structure to crypto exchanges as well to ensure that they are taking a step with respect to taking responsibility for their own actions, being regulated by appropriate regulators to ensure that they are properly governed, that they have the resources to protect themselves, as well as the fact that they're developing standards and measures for consumer protection and market integrity through their own resources, so SROs. And in addition, obviously, just to conclude, it's so important to have meetings like this one. This is, incredibly, incredibly important to bring all these folks in the room to talk through these ideas and solutions, because it is hard. And I'd really like to congratulate the wonderful Commissioner Johnson here for her thought leadership in this area, for her creative policy expertise that she's putting forward to sort of bring clarity in this space, because the solutions are going to be long-term, certainly from the structural standpoint, but we do need extremely short-term answers to protect consumers who are clearly vulnerable, given the debacle that we've already seen and the bankruptcy court that is working really hard, but nevertheless showing up the enormous vulnerabilities that crypto customers are facing today. So thank you so very much. It's such an honor to be a part of this meeting.
Thank you, Yesha. And with that, I hand it over to Stephen Schwartz, Stanley A. Starr Distinguished Professor of Law at Duke University Law School.
Thank you, Alessandro, and thank you, Commissioner Johnson, for inviting me. It's an honor. I like to observe that vertical integration of crypto markets can have advantages, although I think the disadvantages outweigh the advantages. But let me try to summarize some of each. The advantages, of course, include possible informational and service efficiencies, including the sharing of resources. Also, there's a limiting of what I call the whom to regulate problem, which is characteristic of decentralized finance or DeFi. If you have a vertical integration, you know pretty much who it is you're going to regulate. But the disadvantages are very profound. And let me give an example, and that is the very significant vertical integration in the residential mortgage-backed securities, or RMBS markets, back at the time of the global financial crisis. Most of the RMBS that were originated and sold were done through vertically integrated banking organizations. And Countrywide epitomizes the problem. Countrywide had a brilliant servicing operation to service the RMBS, to service the mortgage loans, I should say. But there wasn't enough product being originated. So they had an incentive to basically maximize their other profits and they reduce losses to basically originate less than perfect mortgage loans. In some cases, very poor quality mortgage loans. And this eventually led to the problem that caused their bankruptcy. And this was fairly typical of the vertical integration at that time in the RMBS market. This type of tendency of a vertically integrated firm to try to reduce losses in some areas is something that you might also see with any firm, of course, but with a vertically integrated firm, I think it's more likely for certain behavioral psychology reasons. And in volume 52 of the Stanford Law Review, 28 to 31, I've gone through how behavioral psychology can basically incentivize firms to take riskier, excessively risky decisions in order to avoid losses. And I've shown that when you have affiliates within firms, they are more likely to take these very risky decisions. Now, risk-seeking behavior is clearly illustrated not just by the RMBS markets. One could show it as illustrated by Enron's hedging by affiliated special purpose entities. One could show it in the insurance industry, where you have wholly owned, basically, reinsurers providing reinsurance for insurance companies at reduced capital costs. And if we had more time, or maybe in the Q&A, I could get into that. Other possible concerns about vertical integration include, of course, the concentration of power that diminishes competition and creates barriers for entry. And also, vertical integration could, more likely, at least other things being equal, be more likely to spread contagion because the firm is much larger and much more involved in different aspects of the industry. Now, let me put this into perspective. I think with time, the vertical integration that we're now seeing is likely to naturally diminish. And one of the reasons for the vertical integration, of course, is really information asymmetry. the firms that are involved in the crypto space understand it, or at least think they understand it better, and they're more likely to engage in a range of products and services. But over time, as information becomes more available to others, there will be specialist firms that will come in and act as intermediaries. In terms of specific solutions, I think obvious solutions are to require disclosure, increase the transparency, and this is especially possible in the areas of crypto that risk is the greatest. For example, in terms of stable coins, the key there is to make sure that the sponsor of the stable coin is able to redeem the stable coins on demand, depending on who, which investors will demand the redemptions. Another possible approach to vertical integration is to take the tack that is taken by public utility commissions, state PUCs, where you have utilities or other firms that are involved in providing critical services. And in these cases, the public utility commissions often require so-called ring fencing of these critical utilities. And this means to look at the utilities and to try to reduce their vulnerabilities on a targeted basis. And this could work. Again, it gets complicated, but I'd be happy during the Q&A to give examples of how that has been done. Other thoughts, Yesha mentioned the custodian commingling risk. This is a critical risk. One of my favorite hobbies is wine, and I buy a lot of wine futures. There's a lot of uncertainty. If I pay money to buy wine futures and the wine company goes into bankruptcy, do I own the wine bottles when they come in or not? And this is a very similar question to what we have here. And lastly, I think that we need to address with custodians, we need to address the so-called run issue. And that is, let's assume you have a custodian that loses a lot of money. You may well have customers who will want to come in and withdraw their assets. And this is the same issue as you have with bank deposits. And I think the same type of solution, perhaps having some sort of limited government guarantee to which the custodians will pay an insurance fee, might at least begin to lead to an answer. So I will, with that, I will leave it to the next speaker.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Jason Allegrante, Chief Legal and Compliance Officer at Fireblocks.
Thank you, Alessandro, and thank you, Commissioner Johnson, distinguished members of the committee and staff for inviting me today. My remarks should dovetail nicely with themes raised by Yesha and Stephen in their comments. The objective here for me is to really outline a framework for thinking about the nature of custodial risk in the market today, and to suggest some paths forward and some areas for potential future collaboration. So Fireblocks is a software as a service company dedicated to the mission of accelerating institutional adoption of digital asset technologies through an enterprise-grade digital asset management solution. In our 5 years of operation, we have added over 1,500 customers globally, including large financial institutions and retail Fortune 500 companies. Fireblocks' solution is self-custodial. In contrast to intermediated custody, where a third party serves as the custodian of assets on behalf of another, our solution empowers customers to manage and control their own digital asset holdings directly. In our opinion, this model significantly reduces or eliminates counterparty risk while still ensuring best-in-class security. By definition, self-custody is the process by which the custody function is incorporated into the operations of a company. While this strategy of combining multiple functionalities is likely a kind of vertical integration, adoption of self-custodial solutions does not necessarily give rise to the kinds of risks associated with vertically integrated markets, namely heightened risk from concentration, conflicts of interest, or a lack of transparency. To the contrary, in our experience, there are many examples where adoption of self-custodial solutions has produced positive impacts. For example, self-custodial solutions can diminish concentration risk by enabling a variety of market participants to hold digital assets. Self-custodial solutions that operate on blockchain present additional potential benefits. For market regulators, information generated by the on-chain movement of assets can be used to meet a variety of policy objectives, including market surveillance and oversight. For retail customers, on-chain solutions offer the possibility of asset segregation at the blockchain level, a critical protection and a key element in instilling confidence in the integrity of digital asset markets. Unfortunately, it is also our experience that there is nothing inherent in the use of self-custody technology that guarantees positive outcomes. Flawed implementation of technology or negligent or willful mismanagement are not only likely to result in severe operational disruption and eventual customer loss, they have resulted in these outcomes too many times already. There's no single explanation for why firms continue to experience loss related to the deployment of custodial technology. Every incident is different. We do know, however, that there is no guidance, direction, rule, or standard at the federal level, including anything that follows from the attainment of qualified custodian status under the Customer Protection Rule, that would require market participants to implement best practices around the operation of self-custodial solutions and thereby improve outcomes for the industry and its customers. To conclude, there are clearly risks related to the integration of self-custodial solutions into business operations. However, these risks appear to have more to do with the inconsistent deployment of new technologies and the absence of binding standards than they have to do with structural problems stemming from the vertical integration of the custody function. The industry can and must do more to contribute to solving these problems. For that reason, Fireblocks is actively engaged with policymakers around the world in the development of custodial standards that cut across service models of custody and self-custody to address the inherent risks of securely managing assets in the digital context. In order to preserve the United States' position as a global leader in standard setting, we would urge this committee to continue its engagement with the industry on these important topics. We look forward to productive exchange of ideas in the Q&A, and we thank you sincerely for inviting us.
Thank you, Jason. So with that, I hand it over to Chen Arad, Chief External Affairs Officer at Solidus Labs.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the honor of being invited to speak here, Commissioner Johnson, and thank you for the honorable commissioners, members of the committee, and of course, my esteemed fellow panelists. I hope this will dovetail great and provide some context, specifically from our angle of focus, which is market manipulation. For the past 6 years, Solidus has been focused on defining and ensuring crypto and DeFi market integrity. We monitor hundreds of billions of trading events per day on 150 venues where more than 25 million users and entities trade, with the goal of detecting, typologizing, and thwarting market manipulation and abuse. From this vantage point, I'm going to try and use my time today to exemplify new and unique market integrity abuse concerns caused by crypto's market structure. However, again, connecting to many of the points raised before I started speaking, simultaneously, I also hope to convey the massive emerging opportunity that crypto's market structure provides for more proactive, automated, and real-time detection and enforcement. It's more behavioral based, which ultimately we believe can lead to safer and more demonstrably integrity-driven markets. As we know, vertical integration naturally can potentially facilitate market manipulation. Influence over multiple stages of the financial value chain may be exploited to manipulate prices and enable behaviors like front running or insider trading, and among many other forms of market abuse. And I think that the speakers before me gave really great examples for some ways in which vertical integration manifests, and it can be interpreted as appearing in crypto markets. In our work, monitoring for behaviors like insider trading, wash trading, spoofing, etc., in crypto markets, we consistently find that crypto's biggest merits are also inherent challenges from a traditional market integrity perspective. In that sense, decentralization, permissionlessness, disintermediation are all core to crypto's promise of more transparency, efficiency, accessibility to finance, and more personal control over our money. But they also create an environment where it's easier for any market participant to operate across multiple stages of the value chain and, in a sense, be vertically integrated. If I break this down a little further, in practice, the openness and disintermediation of the crypto ecosystem, and furthermore in the DeFi ecosystem, naturally means it is harder to limit access to material information. Permissionlessness means it's harder to monitor that those with access to material information have not deployed unreported wallets to trade unbeknownst to their employers or regulators, as one example. The transparency of blockchain-based assets means sophisticated actors can monitor the blockchain to gain material information. And finally, decentralization, which of course is a word the industry, that is very core to the industry's ideals. Decentralization means assets are never traded only in one place. Once an ERC20 token, for example, is deployed on Ethereum, it can freely be traded on many decentralized exchanges, and its price is ultimately decided across all the markets it's traded on to some degree, including both on-chain trading on decentralized exchanges and off-chain trading on centralized exchanges. So quite a few new complexities, just a few examples here. Now, let us consider this from the angle of insider trading, which we just published an extensive report on. Specifically insider trading on DEXs. We utilized our DEX-based decentralized exchanges, a DEX, of course, DEX-based insider trading detection tool to look at a sample of major centralized crypto platforms and found that of all the 234 ERC20 tokens, those are the most common Ethereum tokens listed on those platforms since the beginning of 2021, 56%, more than half, were accompanied by evidence of insider trading-like behavior on decentralized exchanges. So it is important for me to emphasize that while leading centralized platforms take great care, and in some cases have developed cutting-edge programs to try and prevent this, the reality is that for insider traders, decentralized assets and exchanges are game changers. Essentially, in the vast majority of the 411 instances of insider trading we found across those 234 tokens, a wallet or a group of wallets used the decentralized exchange to buy the token, to buy the token on a DEX in the days before it was listed or announced to be listed on a centralized exchange, and then sold the token within hours of the news about the listing once the price increased for profit. The report finds, among other things, 105 traders with distinct insider behavior, including 10 serial insiders who were involved in more than 10 instances, and 3 serial insiders who seem to have been involved in more than 25 of these instances. These insiders could be anyone, again, with potential access to information, which in the crypto ecosystem is a different ballgame at the moment. So they could be anyone with potential access to information about listings. Could be members of the projects issuing the tokens, investors, sophisticated traders, platform employees, or anyone who any of those groups have shared information. However, I want to start concluding optimistically, emphasizing that crypto's unique market structure also holds within it the key to addressing these and other challenges, because trading on decentralized exchanges is fully transparent, using the right crypto native and blockchain analytics tools allowed us, as it could allow regulators and platforms themselves to detect this evidence for insider trading without any external need. Again, relying on the transparency of blockchain-based assets. Venues, regulators, and even users can also detect in real time, automatically based simply on trading behavior on the blockchain when any behavior that looks like insider trading is taking place. And of course, build standards and rules, again, to reference some of the suggestions from my fellow panelists that can help prevent this, or at least reduce it. It's important to remember that insider trading, unfortunately, is a behavior that still exists, often undetected, even in the most traditional regulated markets. A study by the University of Technology Sydney finds that 5% of all earnings announcements and 20% of mergers and acquisitions are often accompanied by insider trading. But in the case of crypto markets, thanks to the structure, unlike in traditional finance, crypto malicious activity like insider trading on decentralized exchanges is transparent and detectable, paving a way for proactive, automated regulation and enforcement in real time. If monitored for in a crypto native and the necessary cross-market and cross-on and off-chain manner. With the right thinking, collaboration between industry and regulators, and technological tools, this path can ultimately lead to safer, more transparent, and demonstrably integrity-driven markets that are also more accessible and provide investors and consumers and users more options for autonomy over their funds. And of course, I know we're short on time. I'm happy to elaborate on some ways in which the industry is already promoting this, and of course, answer any other questions. I'll finish with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen, and thank you to all the panelists for your insightful contributions. So it's 12:03. We have about 15 to 17 minutes left for additional comments. I know that some of the panelists have additional comments that would like to elaborate on some of the points made, but before I hand it over to the panelists, I'd just like to see if we have any comments or questions from any of the attendees. I see a question from Dick Berner, who is also a member of MRAC and a number of the work streams in the CCP Risk and Governance Subcommittee. Dick, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Alessandro. I am a member of 2 subcommittees, but not this one. But I have done some work on governance in the crypto industry jointly with Bill Cohen and Carolyn Wilkins in the context of the Bretton Woods committee. And we've written a piece on governance, so I think this relates very closely to comments by Yesha, by Stephen, and others. And we identify 4 things that we might borrow in thinking about crypto governance for the industry from what we might call TradFi. The first is identification of an agreement on shared codes of conduct and best practices in governance among crypto industry participants. The second is implementing high standards for transparency. Third, constructive industry regulatory engagement. And last, global coordination among standard setters. I think all 4 of those were implicit in remarks that we've heard today, but I think it's worth going over them and thinking about how they might be made more explicit. And I think the commission itself, with whom I participated in the past on governance, related to CCPs, I think this is aligned with that kind of work, and the combination of industry work as well as collaboration with the commission, I think might be constructive. I want to take the opportunity to be on this to also thank very much the work on reference rates by Ann Battle, by Sandy O'Connor, and by Tom Whiff especially, who is a good friend. Thanks, Alessandro.
Many thanks, Dick. And then, of course, the Commission has approved the final rules on CCP governance, which, as you indicate, will be a very good point of reference for us as we look into digital assets. So with that, I see a hand raised from Kevin Werbach. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks to all of the panelists. Most of the comments were focused on centralized intermediaries in the digital asset space. Ken talked a little bit at the end about DEXs. I'm curious if any of you have thoughts about DeFi and other kinds of decentralized vehicles like DAOs. On the one hand, it becomes more difficult to apply traditional kinds of regulatory obligations to anything that's decentralized. On the other hand, they tend to be more transparent and rule-based, and some of the activities, for example, that we saw with FTX would not necessarily be possible in the same way with DeFi. So any thoughts on how we should think about the significance of DeFi and decentralized applications from a risk management standpoint here?
Yeah, so I'll hop in, although others I know may have comments as well. Thanks so much, Kevin. It was actually something I was going to address as part of my additional comments. I'll talk about it now. But before we hop into, my questions on how to address risk in DeFi, I think we should define what DeFi is, which is a software-based system that allows users to engage in economic transactions in a self-directed manner where there is no custody and no centralized intermediary that is otherwise controlling or having an impact on user assets. I think some of the problems that we've seen or some of the issues that we address with DeFi today is where people are conflating, oh, I use smart contracts for this, but otherwise I'm doing things off chain. So you'll see people, even in derivatives markets, I think this actually happens a bit more in loans, where they will do loan origination, KYC, and all of these things off chain. And then they'll memorialize the loan on an on-chain smart contract-based system. That I would not call DeFi. And I think we have to be really honest about where there are centralized points of intermediaries or intermediation in these types of transactions, including in the derivatives markets, because in smart contract-based derivatives protocols, there are certain times where there are points of centralization. So from a risk mitigation standpoint, I think we need to be really honest in looking for that so we can think about what that is. When you get to a truly decentralized state, and I know people think it is very hard to define decentralization, I typically look at it from 3 different aspects. The first being technological. So is it all open source or source available so you can see the entirety of the code? That's particularly important because if you can see where everything happens in an open and transparent way, it's a one way to ensure that there's nothing happening off chain through a centralized entity. The other point is, especially when we're talking about a DeFi protocol, we're not talking about a layer 1 or layer 2 network or blockchain, but if you're just looking at a DeFi protocol, is it deployed to a permissionless network where there are multiple and diffuse nodes so that you don't have a very centralized point that's otherwise is sort of permissioning access into the DeFi protocol? And then the second prong of decentralization is administrative. So it's something you sort of referenced, Kevin, with respect to DAOs. Is there someone holding an administrative key? Is there a centralized intermediary that is otherwise permissioning who gets in or permissioning some aspect of it or otherwise controlling the protocol? When we think about DAOs and governance, people have really thought a lot about, well, if there's concentration governance token holders who can vote, isn't that a point of centralization? And I think that's a much more nuanced question, whereas if users have sufficient information, so this is something that Chen was talking about, which is, can you get the information as a user in advance? Is there enough transparency? And, if there's a vote going on and I have all my assets in a particular protocol, will I know if there's a change going to be made? Because even if there are 4 big token holders who can vote and implement the change, if I have time to have, and this goes to what Jason was talking about with self-custody on some level, if I have custody over my own assets and can pull them out before the vote goes through, really query whether there is full control by these, concentration of governance token holders. The last piece of decentralization isn't something about this idea of centralized point of control, but I think it's very, very important when we think about customer protection in our financial markets, which is there the original software developer or some other group that people are relying on, whether rightly or wrongly, by the public statements they make? This goes to what Chen was saying about disclosures and about transparency as well. But if you are otherwise making representations publicly in a way that causes users to rely on you or think there is a centralized point of control so that you can actually save them in the case where something goes wrong or their assets, then you have some form of liability. So when you get to this question of DeFi and risk mitigation there, Kevin, I think you have to look for centralization first. We talked about the points of decentralization, including from a customer protection perspective. The other thing that I will say is, I think we talk in a regulatory perspective, same risk, same regulation. And what I would really say is, different risks, same regulatory outcome, or different source of risk, same regulatory outcome. And so when we are looking at where risks may come in a truly decentralized DeFi protocol, they come much more from cyber risk and technical risk. And the way you mitigate that comes from something like an SRO, where you have standards for auditing the code. You have disclosures about the code audits. I actually think one of the things we really need to jump over in the industry is setting standards for the auditors themselves, because there are audit firms who are looking at the code who are supposedly the best in the industry, but we don't know sort of the ways in which they are working and why those are better than others who may be less expensive, but still have good auditors and things like that. So source of risk is another really important thing to look at in DeFi as well. But I know other panelists may want to weigh in here, so I will close my remarks on that there.
Thank you, Rebecca. We have a handful more minutes. Any more contributions from any attendees or the panel?
I'm happy. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Professor.
Oh, I was simply going to say that if you do have DeFi, you know, I mentioned this during my presentation. This is a whom to regulate problem. And of course, one way of addressing DeFi is to try to have the law define who should be responsible. You know, I know that the FATF has, basically recommended that for things like know your customer and such, that you have virtual, I'm losing the phrase, but the VASP service providers that would provide this function. And so I haven't gotten into a lot of the nitty gritty of how to achieve that. But as a conceptual matter, I simply observe that there is that perspective.
Hen?
Yeah, no, I'll just briefly say that I think the crypto industry, definitely the DeFi industry loves to talk about decentralization, and the reality is that the assets are decentralized. However, we sometimes forget that a lot of the activity is not, and the fact that ultimately, from our vantage point of understanding price health, the activity is ultimately happens across both on and off chain sources, both centralized and decentralized, in both centralized and decentralized locations, is a fundamental infrastructural challenge, but really what I try to convey also an opportunity. The way we think about it, decentralization is not a binary. It's not either or, it's not to replace, it's a spectrum. Ultimately, we believe decentralized financial product will expand the realm of options any of us has to do finance, hopefully in a way that helps finance better serve society. The ability for both of these decentralized and centralized finance to operate on the same spectrum depends on flattening the risk question, and that goes through crypto-specific standards, crypto-specific tools, and specifically the need to monitor for risks cross on and off chain and across multiple markets at the same time. It's a challenge, but again, also an opportunity.
So, Hen, thinking of your remarks, I think back to how can we ensure that we guarantee the basic standards in terms of protecting customer assets, protecting from malicious actors, and then once we guarantee those minimum requirements, then that enables us to account for the flexibility in terms of the spectrum that you mentioned in terms of the different market structures that can be deployed to address the needs of the industry. We have a few more minutes, and we can go over a little bit if needed. So just wanted to see if anyone else wanted to contribute to this conversation. Okay, very good.
I have one quick thing that I wanted to address, because I ran through the sort of 3 types of vertical integration really quickly at the end, because I didn't want to take too much time or go over my time too much. But one of the things that I wanted to say, especially on some of the main vertical integration issues that we're all really worried about, where you're operating a market or exchange and you're also operating a trading firm that operates on the exchange. One, that is not something that has only happened in the crypto asset markets. That's happened in other markets as well. Probably not as much the derivatives markets, but I know we do have sort of captive clearing in the derivatives markets, which raises some similar types of issues, but these have been addressed through regulation before, specifically information partitions, disclosures, and then at the end of the day, through an SRO. So we don't have to come up with rules and regulations for these centralized crypto asset markets out of whole cloth. And I think if we import a lot of the rules that have developed, including to mitigate the vertical integration issues we see in the derivatives markets, they will work in the same way for the crypto asset markets, notwithstanding how novel these markets feel.
Yes, and indeed, Rebecca, the question has come up before, right after Dodd-Frank, as we were implementing the rules for clearing of OTC derivatives with, for instance, looking at the role of FCMs, where you had a clearing business and a trading business housed under the same corporate structure. So yes, we do have a roadmap for looking at these issues. And again, the point is, what is it that we need to account for in the new market structure that needs to be dealt with? But again, without forgetting the lessons that we have learned through decades of experience in other markets. Any other contributions on the topic? Okay, very good. So I thank everyone for a very fruitful conversation. Please feel free to reach out to me or Commissioner Johnson with additional comments. I know that this is one of the many steps in continuing our conversation with the industry so that we can address these topics. With that, I hand it back over to Chair Crichton. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Alessandro, and thanks to all of our speakers there. Very helpful. Next, I'll turn to developments that will likely inform the work streams of the client-related market risk subcommittee. During our March 8th, 2023 meeting, Sonia Gibbs, a member of the board for the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, shared regulatory and market updates. Today, we'll hear a presentation from Tyson Slocum, Director of Public Citizens Energy Program, and Peter Malashev from Cadwallader, Wickersham, and Taft. Tyson and Peter, thanks for joining us. Over to you.
Great to be here. I guess I'll go first, Peter. Real pleasure to be here today. Commissioner Johnson, as always, thank you for your leadership. And I just wanted to echo some of the comments by Commissioner Mersinger at the beginning, just how rewarding it's been working with the Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee, particularly Commissioner Mersinger's focus on getting us out of Washington, D.C. and into the field in places like Oklahoma and Utah to actually see where manufacturing and commodities are being utilized in the field. So it's just been incredibly rewarding. So, talking about the voluntary carbon markets, not long ago, it appeared pretty routine for major corporations and other entities to announce net zero commitments that largely relied on carbon offsets. But as these pledges were subject to increased scrutiny, carbon offset markets have been exposed as deeply flawed and rife with bad actors. Recent initiatives by some of the self-governing organizations to try and address these liabilities have really failed to resolve the underlying credibility problems. In fact, I recently participated in a conversation with the head of derivatives for a multinational mining corporation who declared flatly that they would not engage in the voluntary carbon offset market at all because of concerns about the lack of integrity of carbon offset markets. And I think there's a lot of other industries and companies that share that view. So I really question whether carbon offsets can actually be an effective tool to address the climate crisis. Instead, we really should be encouraging actions that produce direct emission avoidance from point and mobile sources and from supply chains. That said, I do support efforts to impose regulatory standards for carbon offset markets. And that's why I really applaud the CFTC's leadership in announcing just last month the creation of this new environmental fraud task force within the CFTC's Division of Enforcement to, among many other things, encourage whistleblowers to come forward to expose fraud in the offset market. And I'm really excited, as Commissioner Johnson mentioned at the onset, that the CFTC is hosting this second voluntary carbon offset convening on July 19th. And obviously really excited that Commissioner Johnson is reviving the Climate Risk Subcommittee. I think some of the issues that a subcommittee could address, I think, could build on some recent suggestions by Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero, where she talked about implementing a heightened review framework for self-certified carbon offset products, very similar to what the CFTC did for digital assets, and that the CFTC could also launch efforts to directly educate consumers about the realities of carbon offsets. So again, I'm very encouraged by recent actions by the CFTC to start directly tackling this problematic market, and really look forward to working with the subcommittee on ways to more firmly engage the CFTC on these markets. Peter, off to you.
Thank you, Tyson. This is a perfect summary of my general thoughts that I was going to share. Again, thank you and good afternoon. Thank you, Commissioner Johnson and members of the MRAC for inviting me to speak today. I'm Peter Malashev, partner at Cadwalader in Washington, D.C. and my practice really covers all matters within the CFTC's purview, but more and more increasingly in the past 2 or 3 years, I have been seeing matters relating to environmental commodities. We have recently experienced wildfire smoke blanket most of the United States. And just last week, global temperatures broke records, not just once, but several times. Clearly, public awareness is catching up with the realization that we simply cannot carry on with business as usual. For example, sales of electric vehicles, again, it's not mandated, but they have been growing exponentially, and environmental commodities are used more and more. But again, I agree with what Tyson's sentiment was in his recent meeting with the mining company, that there are clearly some issues that we will discuss today, what can be done to address these. The work that the CFTC is doing in this area, in the area of climate change, exemplifies that regulators too are catching up and exploring how these markets will likely develop, and what can be done to make sure that these markets develop as reliable, transparent, and most importantly, not associated with fraud and manipulation. As market regulator, the CFTC has a unique expertise in enforcing and implementing a 100-year-old Commodity and Exchange Act. We have all seen that this act and this market structure that developed under this regime has worked incredibly well through multiple crises, especially in the past 2 decades. And clearly, commodity lawyers have seen it all. So this experience will be tremendously valuable in developing of this market as well. Let's flip to the first page, please. So let's look at what do we have here? How are these markets developing? There are a number of environmental products already traded in the United States and globally, and these are primarily carbon credits, CCAs, WCAs that will come on board relatively soon, LCFS and SRECs, and many others. What is interesting is that unlike other traditional physical commodities, such as natural gas, crude oil, or even electricity, the underlying commodity here is not carbon-based molecules. You cannot really touch a carbon offset. You cannot really inhale it or do really anything. Similarly, the electrons that are represented under a SREC, a solar renewable energy certificate, it's a separate stream, a separate commodity, but the SREC itself is really more of a mental product. It doesn't exist in nature. So this is one of the fundamental concepts that, again, markets need to realize that these types of commodities were created by humans, not by nature. CFTC SEC 2012 products definitions have a discussion on environmental commodities, and they have provided guidance that these are indeed qualified as commodities. And also, most importantly, these qualify as physical commodities, meaning that can actually be delivered. And this is a very important factor or attribute of these commodities, meaning that they can be subject to a forward contract by being physically delivered, because a lot of other intangible commodities cannot be subject to a forward contract. And ergo, because they can be physically delivered, they can trade these commodities such as carbon offset in the interstate commerce. Having said that, not all environmental commodities would technically qualify as commodities. And for example, there are some unique regional products that would not qualify as commodities. So the takeaway here is that it's not, you cannot just assume that if something is an environmental product, it would automatically qualify as a commodity. Separately, derivatives such as futures, swaps, and options on environmental commodities do qualify as commodity interests, and they do qualify as derivatives. And again, as Tyson has mentioned, that there is a fair amount of overlap that we're seeing between these types of commodities and digital assets generally. For example, if you look at the recent congressional proposals relating to digital assets markets, if an environmental product were to be traded and transferred through the distributed ledger technology, it would technically qualify as a digital asset or digital commodity. And technically, it could be subject to regulation that is being proposed. So it is inevitable that Congress at some point will tackle that issue as well. Next slide, please. So what types of markets do we have here? And again, mostly we're talking about the carbon markets. There are really two in the United States. There is a compliance market that is mandated by individual states, not by the federal regime, and there is a voluntary market. Compliance markets are much more reliable, and this is really through the way how they originate. They come from a state-implemented statute, and they relate to a regime that has been established, for example, in California or the Reg States. It's not to say that there are not some issues that still need to be worked out. And if you read, for example, California cap and trade statute, there are some misspellings relating to the CFTC and other things that really need to be clarified. For example, the issues relating to security collateral. Voluntary markets, as the name implies, they are voluntary. And there are a lot more issues with these. Nobody is mandated to participate in these markets. And there are clearly issues relating to additionality and reliability, and with other registries that we will refer a little bit further down. And there's a third market, technically, the Article 6 Paris International Compliance Market, but that has not really emerged in the United States because there's really no federal or national scheme established. Next slide, please. So how do we come in here as lawyers, and how does the CFTC come in here? The recent advisory that just came out a few weeks ago relating to whistleblowers in environmental markets alludes to two levels of CFTC's jurisdiction. The first one is the anti-fraud and anti-manipulation jurisdiction over traded commodities on spot and forward markets. And again, as I mentioned earlier, environmental commodities do qualify as commodities, and they qualify as physically deliverable, and therefore they can trade in the interstate commerce. If they do, the CFTC would have enforcement jurisdiction, which is not a regulatory jurisdiction. But if those commodities are subject to fraud, or manipulation if someone is trying to, let's say, corner a market in LCFS, the CFTC would technically have jurisdiction to prosecute that fraud. And that's what that advisory specifically refers to. There was a letter issued by a group of senators last year in October in response to the RFI, and they do encourage that the CFTC become more involved in policing these markets. The second level of CFTC's jurisdiction, and that is the grant of exclusive jurisdiction, but that would apply only to derivatives such as swaps, futures, and options. And indeed, we are seeing proliferation of these contracts as well. There are almost or over now 200 environmental-based futures contracts that trade on designated contract markets in the United States. And with respect to those contracts, futures, the CFTC clearly has exclusive jurisdiction. There's also an actively developing OTC market in swaps relating to environmental products and other sustainability-related products. And over those too, the CFTC does have exclusive jurisdiction. Now the questions come up, what can the CFTC do, given that the CFTC is limited in its jurisdiction relating to commodities traded into interstate commerce, and the absolute majority of environmental products do trade in as commodities, not as derivatives, even though, again, as I mentioned, some of them do trade as derivatives. These would be spot markets or forward markets. And clearly the CFTC is looking here that these markets should also be subject to CFTC's enforcement purview. And for example, setting up a spot market would be subject to CFTC's jurisdiction. And there's also increased interest in setting up these markets on the already existing platforms, such as DCM platforms. And one of the examples is the CME has, sorry about that. CME has, sorry about that, a milk product that trades as a spot market on a DCM platform. So clearly that type of functionality can be used to accommodate trading commodity markets. The CFTC is a very important thought leader in this space, and such things as reporting or verification, for example, or verification of deliverable supply and how trading platforms work, all of that is absolutely critical in making sure that however these markets develop in the future, they will be trustworthy and they will be reliable. We certainly do not want to have a developing market to be plagued from the get-go with the issues relating to reliability. Next slide, please. So let's look briefly at what are we seeing developing in the markets in these two aspects, the voluntary and the compliance market. And this is really just in the past, I would say 6 months that we're seeing. The first one, I would say, is the retailification of carbon trading. There's increased interest on the retail side, and this really comes very close with the trends we're seeing with digital currencies and cryptos, that a lot of retail participants want to participate in these markets. And also smaller institutions, small farms, and not just large corporates want to take a stake and participate in these markets. And for example, show there's apps being developed to show how what is your carbon footprint and what can you do to mitigate that. So we're clearly going to see this development. And again, the CFTC and to a certain extent the SEC as a retail protection agencies will will certainly will have to play a very active role in protecting American public. Utilization of carbon contracts and project finance and sustainability-linked instruments, for example, bonds or sustainability-linked loans. We're seeing a huge increase in these instruments. And again, as I mentioned, it's not to say that there are no problems or matters that need to be resolved, again, with, for example, California cap and trade, but work is being done and local regulators are very actively working with market participants to resolve any issues that may appear once in a while, because again, this is basically a greenfield operation. There's greater interest in hedging and speculation and proliferation of listed futures based on environmental commodities, and this always follows when a spot market or a future or forward market develops, the cash market, that the derivatives would certainly follow that development. Greater appreciation that climate crisis is real, and societies needs to also focus on climate mitigation. This is not a concession, but really facing the reality that some changes are irreversible, and we really need to retool our financial industry and industry as a whole with that understanding. Again, the past week has been sent very clear signals that this year is extraordinary. There is unfortunately limited trading volume in voluntary carbon markets because of concerns with reliability and greenwashing. Again, as Tyson has introduced, that there was a huge rush into these markets, but now market participants are realizing that not all carbon credits are created equal. Some have a lot more reliability than others, and a lot of market voluntary organizations are working on this to create some sort of principles that would address these issues. Greater use for consumption. Corporates are buying voluntary carbon credits to reduce their carbon footprint and retire the credits, not just to show, so to really demonstrate that greenwashing is a concern. Transfer instruments for tax equity credits under the IRA. This was a great step forward with legislation, and also wrapping carbon trading and environmental products generally into ESG policies under sustainability criteria. The CFTC is doing a lot of work here, as does the SEC, and just generally the markets are looking into these tools. To summarize what we have is, even though the CFTC does have limited jurisdiction to address these markets for now, a lot can be done. A lot can be done on the policing of the carbon credits markets generally in the interstate commerce as a commodity, as a traded commodity, as well as act as a thought leader. And the convening that will happen next week is a great example of what the CFTC can do as a market regulator to enhance public trust in these markets and put in place market structures that have worked very well for other commodities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. We'll open up to other MRAC members for discussion. Just give it a few seconds, see if we see any hands here. Okay, well, I don't see any hands, so I think that actually concludes our meeting for today. So thank you all very much. We appreciate the insights from our guest speakers as well as the contributions from our MRAC members. And Commissioner, do you have any final remarks?
I do. Thanks so much, Alicia. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your patience at the start of the meeting as we navigated technological issues. It's astonishing that we are sitting to think through the regulation of issues as complex as the integration of artificial intelligence and the adoption of or migration to cloud technologies, the integration of blockchain technologies, and the rise of digital assets. And we're still navigating Zoom. So all a lot to suggest that there's much work to be done. In fact, I'd highlight some of the very thoughtful commentary offered by presenters or panelists today that really should inform the discussions for the MRAC subcommittees as we move forward. It was helpful to hear from CCP Risk and Governance as they launched the 3 work streams that they will be thoughtful about. We anticipate that a few additional members will be added to each of the subcommittees as we move forward, and we're grateful and excited for the Commission and fellow commissioners' support of the development of the membership for each of those work streams and encouragement. I thank Biz Chatterjee, who is co-chair of the Market Structure Subcommittee, who went on to describe specific work streams that subcommittee has taken up. These are work streams that were launched last year in September of 2022, and in fact, in so many instances, one of the joys that I have and privileges that I have enjoyed as sponsor of the MRAC committee is inheriting the work that was launched by CCP Risk and Governance, co-chaired previously by our chair, Alicia Crichton, who is serving as chair emeritus for the subcommittee, and the Market Structure Subcommittee that had both of which had longstanding work streams that we are continuing to support. I'm also deeply thoughtful about IRBR, our subcommittee that we are retiring as of last month or just a week ago, and its tremendous accomplishments across the industry, its tremendous success in establishing a blue ribbon first-in-class example of how the public and private sector can work in collaboration to accomplish very important goals. The migration away from LIBOR being an exceptional example, and the efforts undertaken by then Chair Tom With, who we lament isn't with us today, but celebrate in his absence, he and the many members of both the IRBR subcommittee and the ARC in their efforts to help move the markets forward with respect to that transition. Finally, I would like to suggest that I think it was exceptionally exciting to hear from panelists, experts who are helping to inform and shape our thinking about and the membership that will serve on the 2 subcommittees that we're standing up, brand new, fledgling, during the term of my service, and they are the Future of Finance Subcommittee, and we're continuing the work Chair Benham began under the Climate-Related Market Risks Subcommittee. We're thankful for the panelists who shared today. We're thankful for their reflections. We appreciate that there may be additional comments or suggestions that we might receive from members as we move forward, as well as from the general public. I believe the comment period is open through a week after our meeting today. We welcome those comments. They will certainly directly inform our agenda. A significant part of any success that the MRAC enjoys is the result of many who contribute as part of the committee themselves, members, their time and talent, but also there are a number of industry professionals whose contributions we should not overlook, and certainly the staff in their support of all the initiatives and their thoughtfulness about all the recommendations that MRAC puts forward should be commended. So we thank you for your time today, and Chair Crichton, I'll hand the meeting back to you, and I believe to Marilee Dahlman, our ADFO, to close the meeting out.
Right, thank you, Commissioner and Chair Crichton. I want to thank everyone for attending this MRAC meeting. This meeting is now adjourned.